Before children are acquainted with conventional ideas of guilt and punishment, they realize that it is easier to bring about good events through wishing than it is to bring about unhappy ones. The child carries with him or her the impetus and supporting energy provided him at birth from Framework 2, and he knows intuitively that desires conducive to his development happen easier than those that are not. His natural impulses naturally lead him toward the development of his body and mind, and he is aware of a cushioning effect and support as he acts in accordance with those inner impulses. The child is innately honest. When he gets sick, he intuitively knows the reason why, and he knows quite well that he brought about the illness. Parents and physicians believe, instead, that the child is a victim, ill for no personal reason, but indisposed because of elements attacking him, either the outside environment or something working against him from within. The child may be told, "You have a cold because you got your feet wet," or "You caught the cold from Johnny or Sally." He may be told that he has a virus so that it seems his body itself was invaded despite his will. He learns that such beliefs are acceptable. It is easier to go along than to be honest, particularly when honesty would often involve a kind of communication his parents might frown upon, or the expression of emotions that are quite unacceptable. Mother's little man or brave little girl can then stay at home, for example, courageously bearing up under an illness with his or her behavior condoned. The child may know that the illness is the result of feelings that the parents would consider quite cowardly, or otherwise involves emotional realities that the parents simply would not understand. Gradually, it becomes easier for the child to accept the parents' assessment of the situation. Little by little, the fine relationship, the precise connections between psychological feelings and bodily reality erode. I do not want to oversimplify, and throughout this book we will add other elaborations upon such behavior. The child who gets the mumps with a large number of his classmates, however, knows he has his private reasons for joining into such a mass biological reality. And usually the adult who fall prey to a flu epidemic has little conscious awareness of his own reasons for such a situation. He does not understand the mass suggestions involved, or his own reasons for accepting them. He is usually convinced instead that his body has been invaded by a virus despite his own personal approval or disapproval. Despite his own personal approval or disapproval. That's more emphatically. He repeated that twice. He is therefore a victim, and his sense of personal power is eroded. When a person recovers from such an ordeal, he or she usually grants his recovery to the result of the medication he has been given. Or he may think that he was simply lucky, but he does not grant himself to have any real power in such an affair. The recovery seems to occur to him as the illness seems to happen to him. Usually the patient cannot see that he brought about his own recovery and was responsible for it, because he cannot admit that his own intents were responsible for his own illnesses. He cannot learn from his own experience then, and each bout of illness will appear largely incomprehensible. Some years ago, before our sessions actually began, in late 1963, though immediately previous, Rupert Jane had an experience that he has described in his own books. That event resulted in a scribbled manuscript, unpublished, called The Physical Universe as Ideal Construction. His desire and intense intent to understand more of the nature of reality triggered the production of that fragmentary automatic manuscript. He found himself as a young adult at the time of the President Kennedy assassination, in a world that seemed to have no meaning, At the same time, while conditioned by the beliefs of his generation, beliefs that still tinge your time, he held on to one supporting belief never completely lost from childhood. His belief, illogical as it sounded when spoken, contradictory as it seemed when applied to daily life, stated that the individual somehow could perceive the nature of reality on his or her own by virtue of innate capacities that belong to the individual by right, capacities that were a part of man's heritage. In other words, Rupert felt that there was a slim chance of opening doors of knowledge that had been closed, and he decided to take that chance. The results appearing initially in that now yellowed handwritten script made him initially see that he had chosen the events of his life in one way or another, and that each person was not the victim but the creator of those events that were privately experienced or jointly encountered with others. In that literally power-packed few hours, he also knew that the physical senses did not so much perceive concrete phenomena, but actually had a hand in the creation of events that were then perceived as actual. End of discussion. End of dictation. Still entranced, Jane now came through with a few paragraphs of material for us. Among them was this insight, which Seth related to his discussion of the Cinderella fairy tale. Forgive the terminology, but you each believed in magic, or the sessions never would have started. You believed that reality had more to it than the senses showed. You believed that together you could achieve what had not been achieved earlier, that you could somehow or other offer meaningful and real solutions to the world's problems. Note session. At first, Jane and I thought Seth was in error when he said chariot instead of coach or carriage, but from the dictionary we learned that in archaic terms a chariot could be a four-wheeled, lightweight carriage used something for pleasure or on certain affairs of state. Jane and I watched an adaptation of the westernized Cinderella fairy tale, of course. I almost didn't bother looking it up, but I'm glad I did, for we learned that the power of Cinderella has been much longer lasting and more pervasive than we'd realized. The Cinderella tale reaches back to China in the 9th century and exists in hundreds of versions around the world. The 806th session proper can be found in Chapter 2, but in the deleted portion of that session, Seth came through with some comments relative to children there some of the words are messed up. I'm going to skip on down. I can't read that at all. And I'll start with the next session. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. The physical universe is the result of ideal construction, as Rupert perceived in the experience mentioned in the last session. That perception was not the sort of official sense data recognized by your science. Rupert did not come to his recognition of the world's mental source through reasoning. Neither could any ordinary physical perception have given him that information. His consciousness left his body, an event not even considered possible by many educated people. Rupert's consciousness merged, while still retaining its own individuality, with the consciousness of the leaves outside his window, and with the nail in the windowsill, and traveled outward and inward at the same time, so that like a mental wind, his consciousness traveled through other psychological neighborhoods. The origin of your universe is non-physical, and each event, however grand or minute, has its birth in the framework to environment. Your physical universe arose from that inner framework then, and continues to do so. The power that fuels your thoughts has the same source. In a manner of speaking, the universe as you understand it, with all the events that it includes, functions automatically in its important processes as your own body does. Your individual desires and intents direct that activity of your body's spontaneous processes. That is, your body walks across the floor at your command as a result of your wishes, even though the processes involved must happen by themselves. Your intents have a great effect upon your body's health. In the same fashion, jointly, all of the people alive at any given time direct the events of the universe to behave in a certain fashion, even though the processes must happen by themselves or automatically. Other species have a hand in this also, however, and in one way or another, all of you direct the activity of the physical body of the world in much the same way that you each direct your own bodily behavior. Give us a moment. You were born with the impetus toward growth built in, automatically provided with the inner blueprints that would lead to a developed adult form. Not only the cells, but the atoms and the molecules that composed them contained a positive intent to cooperate in a bodily formation, to fulfill themselves, and they were then predisposed not only towards survival, but with an idealization leading toward the best possible development and maturity. All of those characteristics have their sources in Framework 2, for the psychological medium of Framework 2 is automatically conducive to creativity. It is not simply a neutral dimension, therefore, but contains within itself an automatic predisposition toward the fulfillment of all patterns inherent within it. As James said in Rupert's book, the universe is of good intent. It is automatically predisposed again toward the creation of good events. I put the word good in quotes for now because of your misconceptions about the nature of good and evil, which we will discuss somewhat later. To that extent, then, the physical universe, like each physical body, is magical. I use the term purposefully, for it confounds the dictates of your adult reasoning, and perhaps by so confounding what you think of as reason, I may manage to arouse within you a hint of what I refer to as the higher intellect. Reasoning by itself can only deal with deductions made about the known world. It cannot accept knowledge that comes from elsewhere, for such information will not fit in reason's categories and confounds its cause and effect patterning. The power to reason comes from Framework 2. In the terms of this discussion, you are able to reason as a result of magical events that make reason itself possible. The term magic has in one way or another been used to simply describe events for which reason has no answer, events that exist outside of the framework in which reason feels comfortable. Your scientists consider themselves quite rational, yet many of them, at least, would be more honest when they tried to describe the beginning of the universe if they admitted that reason alone cannot provide any true insight. Each of you are as familiar with the so-called birth of the universe, as close to you or as distant from it as your own recognized consciousness is to your own physical birth. For the initiation of awareness and sensation in one instant really carries all of the same questions as those involved with the birth of the universe. Oh no, it was infant. I'll read that again. Each of you are as familiar with the so-called birth of the universe, as close to it or as distant from it as your own recognized consciousness is to your own physical birth. For the initiation of awareness and sensation in one infant really carries all of the same questions as those involved with the birth of the universe. The mother could not consciously control the bodily processes that led to birth. In the truest sense, the birth magically happens, as miraculous in those terms as the so-called initial emergence of life upon the planet itself. Scientific analysis of the brain will tell you nothing about the power that moves your thoughts or hint at the source of the brain's abilities. However, the constant activity between frameworks 1 and 2 is constantly apparent in the very existence of your world and in the relationships involving your imagination, feelings, and beliefs, and those private and shared events that compose your existence. Take your break. And I'll resume here with Seth. I do not mean to speak of reason in derogatory terms, for it is well suited to its purposes, which are vital in your reality. It is also true that in the deepest terms you have not yet developed your reasoning, so that your version of it is bound to result in some distortions. Nor do I mean to agree with those who ask you to use your intuitions and feelings at the expense of your reason. Instead, I will suggest other paths later in this book. Your reasoning, as you now use it, however, deals primarily with reality by dividing it into categories, forming distinctions, following the laws of cause and effect. And largely, its realm is the examination of events already perceived. In other words, it deals with the concrete nature of ascertained events that are already facts in your world. On the other hand, your intuitions follow a different kind of organization, as does your imagination. One involved with associations, an organization that unifies diverse elements and brings even known events together in a kind of unity that is often innocent of the limitations dictated by cause and effect. In those terms, then, Framework 2 deals with associations, so that within it the recognizable events of the physical world can be put together in an infinite number of ways, after which they appear in your private experience according to directions you have given them through those associations that you form mentally. The coincidences that seem to happen, the chance encounters, the unexpected events, all of these come into your experience because in one way or another you have attracted them, even though their occurrences might seem to have insurmountable odds against them. Those odds, those impediments, do not exist in Framework 2. To some extent or another, your intuitions acquaint you with the fact that you have your own place in the universe, and that the universe itself is well disposed toward you. The intuitions speak of your unique and vital part in the fabric of that universe. The intuitions know that the universe bends in your direction. Your reasoning can deal only with results of your physical perception. However, at least with the training your societies have allowed it, you have in fact denied your reasoning the results of important data, for you have taught it to distrust the psychic faculties. Children fairy tales still carry some of that ancient knowledge. So far I have been speaking of Frameworks 1 and 2 separately, and I will continue to do so for your convenience and understanding. Actually, the two merge, of course, for your Framework 1 existence is emerged in Framework 2. Again, your body itself is constantly replenished in Framework 1 because of its simultaneous reality in Framework 2. Framework 2 is ever exteriorizing itself, appearing in your experience as Framework 1. You concentrate so thoroughly upon exterior reality, however, that you often ignore the quite apparent deeper sources of your own physical existence. As a result, you deal with methods of division and categorization so completely that you lose sight of associative organizations, even though you use them constantly in your own most intimate thought processes. End of session unless you have questions. What do you think of Jane helping me with the introductory notes for Volume 2 of Unknown? Emphatically, he says, I think it is an excellent idea. I am letting events magically emerge as they grow beneath the surface of your lives, because Rupert likes happy surprises. He is very active now on other levels and is putting our material to good use. A fond good evening. Thank you, Seth. Good night. Session 825. Jane's book, which is now being typeset, is The After-Death Journal of an American Philosopher, The Worldview of William James. Jane and I are really looking forward to Seth's material on man's misconceptions about the nature of good and evil. Judging from our mail, we know that many others will also be very interested in it. Session 826. Now, good evening. Good evening, Seth. You must understand that in a manner of speaking, let me see if I can make this a little bigger. It got small. Okay. You must understand that in a manner of speaking, Framework 2 is on the one hand an invisible version of the physical universe. On the other hand, however, it is far more than that, for it contains within it probable variations of that universe, from the most cosmic scale, say, down to probable versions of the most minute events of any given physical day. In simple terms, your body has an invisible counterpart in Framework 2. During life, that counterpart is so connected with your own physical tissues, however, that it can be misleading to say that the two, the visible and the invisible bodies, are separate. In the same way that your thoughts have a reality in Framework 2, and only for the sake of a meaningful analogy, thoughts could be said to be the equivalent now of objects. For in Framework 2, thoughts and feelings are far more important, even than objects are in physical reality. In Framework 2, thoughts instantly form patterns. They are the natural elements in that psychological environment that mix, merge, and combine to form, if you will, the psychological cells, atoms, and molecules that compose events. In those terms, the physical events that you perceive or experience can be compared to psychological objects that appear to exist with a physical concreteness in space and time. Such events usually seem to begin somewhere in space and time and clearly end there as well. You can look at an object like a table and see its definitions in space. To some extent, you are too close to psychological events to perceive them in the same fashion, of course. Yet usual experience seems to have a starting point and a conclusion. Instead, experience events usually involve only surface perceptions. You observe a table's surface as smooth and solid, even though you realize it is composed of atoms and molecules full of motion. In the same way, you experience a birthday party, an automobile accident, a bridge game, or any psychological event as psychologically solid with a smooth experience surface that holds together in space and time. Such events, however, consist of indivisible particles and faster-than-light perceptions that never show. In other words, they contain psychic components that flow from Framework 2 into Framework 1. Any event, therefore, has an invisible thickness, a multidimensional basis. Your skies are filled with breezes, currents, clouds, sunlight, dust particles, and so forth. The sky vaults above the entire planet. The invisible vault of Framework 2 contains endless patterns that change as, say, clouds do, that mix and merge to form your psychological climate. Thoughts have what we will for now term electromagnetic properties. In those terms, your thoughts mix and match with others in Framework 2, creating mass patterns that form the overall psychological basis behind world events. Again, however, Framework 2 is not neutral, but automatically inclined toward what we will here term good or constructive developments. It is a growth medium. Constructive or positive feelings or thoughts are more easily materialized than negative ones because they are in keeping with Framework 2's character. If that were not the case, your own species would not have existed as long as it has, nor would the constructs of civilization, art, commerce, or even technology have been possible. Framework 2 combines orders and spontaneity, but its order is of another kind. It is a circular, associative, naturally ordering process in which spontaneity automatically exists in the overall order that will best fulfill the potentials of consciousness. At birth, each person is automatically equipped with the capacity toward natural growth that will most completely satisfy its own abilities, not at the expense of others, but in an overall context in which the fulfillment of each individual assures the fulfillment of each other individual. In those terms, there is an ideal psychological pattern to which you are yourself intimately connected. The inner ego constantly moves you in that direction. On the other hand, that pattern is not rigid but flexible enough to take advantage of changing circumstances, even as a plant will turn toward the sun, though you move it from room to room, while the sunlight varies its directions. The inner ego does not exist in time as you do, however, so it relies upon your assessment of situations with which your reasoning is equipped to cope. Obviously, there are objects of all sizes, durability, and weight. There are private objects and public ones. There are also vast psychological objects, then, sweeping mass events, for example, in which whole countries might be involved. There are also mass natural events of varying degrees, as say the flooding of large areas. Such events involve psychological configurations on the part of all those involved, so that the inner individual patterns of those lives touched by each such event have in one way or another a common purpose that at the same time serves the overall reality on a natural planetary basis. In order to endure, the plane itself must be involved in constant change and instability. I know it is difficult to comprehend, but every object that you perceive, grass or rock or stone, even ocean waves or clouds, any physical phenomena, has its own invisible consciousness, its own intent and emotional coloration. Each is also endowed with patterns toward growth and fulfillment, not at the expense of the rest of nature, but to the contrary, so that every other element of nature may also be completed, all with much emphasis. He said all that with much emphasis. At certain levels, those intents of man and nature may merge. I am speaking in very simple terms now. And yet those involved in a flood, for example, want the past washed away or want to be flooded by bursts of vital emotions, such as disasters often bring. They want to feel a renewed sense of nature's power, and often, though devastated, they use the experience to start a new life. Those with other intents will find excuses to leave such areas. There will be perhaps a chance meeting that will result in a hasty trip. On a hunch, someone else might suddenly leave the area to find a new job or decide to visit a friend in another state. Those whose experiences do not merge with nature's in that regard will not be part of that mass event. They will act on information that comes to them from Framework 2. Those who stay also act on the same information by choosing to participate. When you enter time and physical life, you are already aware of its conditions. You are biologically and psychologically predisposed to grow within that rich environment, to contribute on all levels to the fulfillment of your species, but more than this, to add your own unique viewpoint and experience to the greater patterns of consciousness of which you are a part. You are beginning to understand the intimate connections that exist in your physical environment. The psychological connections, however, are far more complicated, so that each individual's dreams and thoughts interweave with every other person's, forming ever-changing patterns of desire and intent. Some of these emerge as physical events and some do not. Take your break. And I will end this session right here and start the next one in a little while.